Let's go ahead and get started once again. And this is our chance to kind of tie off the bow on talking about ancient cultures really across the eastern western hemisphere. And all across the eastern hemisphere. So we left off talking about ancient Japan up to the Edo period. And we've been talking about things like, prior to that, back in ancient China, things like dragon boat festivals, and in places like modern day Outer Mongolia, how there's this huge emphasis on stuff like horsemanship and horse races and competitions as recreation, but specifically as sort of a good excuse or reason to use recreation for what the Greeks called, in the separate culture, that disinterested cultivation of personality, right? Recreation is an excuse or a means to an end of preparing for war and being physically fit and entertaining the masses, as the Romans did with their gladiatorial battles to the death in the Colosseums of their time. So, with kind of our last couple of thoughts on Japan up until about 1600, remember we were talking about how Shinto Buddhism had become sort of a blended religion on that particular culture's island chain, and how that really influenced their sense of nature not as a place to, as we'll see later on in the United States, not as something to fear or ascribe the presence of Satan to, but as like a persisting and responsive thing. It is a relationship, so to speak, with every animistic spirit in every spring, in every forested cove. There are lots of those in Japan. In every river, and so on and so forth. So the relationship, the attitude, the posture towards land management was very, very different than what we were getting set up to be used to by Western culture here in the United States later on. So with that, we have things like sumo wrestling. And again, that is warfare by proxy, right? Training warriors up and elevating their status in society as athletes, as professional athletes, and rewarding them with things like property, wealth, influence, at some periods concubines, and stuff like that. And we saw how that Shinto and Buddhism were tied to things like sumo wrestling. If you go to or watch a modern day sumo wrestling match these days, it is nothing like WWE or any of those. There's like priests in like ceremonial garb, and they walk around the tournament ring, and they'll do things like the wrestlers will do things like grab a handful of rice before the match and throw it onto the ring, not to, pocket sand somebody in the eyes, but to make an offering of rice to the local gods that might be otherwise offended by that tournament. So we have this religious, not entanglement, but entwinement, enmeshment with things like recreation, with sports and stuff like that in some of these Eastern cultures. And that's pretty much exactly the opposite of how it's going to go for the early United States several centuries from now. But before we get there, we want to talk about early Western Europe. So this is like Europe post-fall of the Roman Empire in the 300s and 400s of the Common Era, and before basically the Renaissance, Enlightenment, stuff like that. Okay, so this is going to be Western Europe to around the year 1500-ish. So the Middle Ages, right? People running around in plate armor and stuff like that. And just trying to Heath Ledger their way through life in A Knight's Tale. we get a feudal system of land. And Japan, our most recent stop on our tour around the world, also developed a feudal system around the time of the Edo period. And that led to a lot of things like its involvement in World War II. Very interesting stuff. But here in Western Europe, we have this principle arising out of a feudal system paired with, up until the 1500s, one Catholic Western Christian church. And so kings and queens derive their right to rule from God. So you have the church involved politically saying King so-and-so, because they are son of King so-and-so, this idea of primogeniture, the firstborn son. You have religious endorsement of political structures and administrative power. So we get people like King Alfred declaring this principle of the 3/8 division of freeborn time. So this is a sense of, this is again a feudal system, so 99% of everybody is a serf. You are tied to the land and you can't really move from that land. You're not a slave, but you don't own the land, so where are you going to move? You won't own land somewhere else that you're working as well. So for the 1%ers, we have this idea of the 3/8 division freeborn time. That is, 3/8 of your time are to be in the cultivation of leisure for you, the 1%er. And everybody else gets to kind of work to support that. So we have a strong so-called bifurcation, a split, a division two ways of serfs versus landed class. So serfs, 90% of what they make, their profit, so to speak, they're just going to spend that on food, right? We don't have modern pesticides. We don't have modern tractors with precision microagriculture driven by satellites and synthetic fertilizers and all of this stuff. We have people hoeing rows by hand. If you've ever seen the old Monty Python Search for the Holy Grail movie, this is like people down in the dirt saying, "Oh, there's a lovely bit of filth over here, Dennis," and just like talking and hanging out, and kings riding by with their knights and just sort of drive-by encounters in that way. So there's a real hard split between everybody and those 1%ers. So if 90% of your earnings were spent on food, if median income in the United States is between, I don't know, it's around $65,000, something like that last time I checked. Imagine spending about $55 out of the $65,000 you make that year, not accounting for taxes, on Easy Mac. To put that in context. And then you have 10% of your income left after taxes to do everything else, like get material for your clothing and make another pair of boots and so on and so forth, right? So this idea of discretionary income isn't a thing for 99% of people up until around the year 1500, right? And it's not going to change rapidly at 1500. It's going to be a slow growth and evolution of this new middle class. That's a very young idea. Just a sense of, I'm not a serf tied to the land, and I'm not the king or queen, or they're nobles or knights or anything. I'm something in the middle, like a merchant, and I do okay. That middle class doesn't exist right now. In 800 CE or AD, in 1000, we're gonna have to get through some pretty nasty moments first. And so we get awesome quotes like from the philosopher historian Hobbes, who says that life in this period is nasty, mean, brutish, and short, right? 99% of people are spending 90% of their effort just to put food on the table, and we're dealing with like a 50% mortality rate from multiple waves of things like bubonic plague, black plague. child mortality, pretty rough. Really rough, right? You have kind of a coin flip chance to survive to age 5. That's not great odds. And then we do have the religious class, a whole bunch of monks. And so in the feudal systems across Europe, typically the arrangement was you have kings and queens and their nobles and their knights, to whom wealth is flowing through taxes from the serfs. And then you've also got land grants to the church. So a noble says, I'm going to give you 10,000 acres of land and the serfs associated with it. And those guys and gals are going to produce food for you, the monks in this monastery. And in return, you, the monks, will care for our eternal souls and do things like teach people. Almost the only literate people in Western Europe up until like the Renaissance, the rebirth period, are monks. And they're reading so that they can read the Bible and curate stuff like papal bulls, messages from the Pope back in Rome, or the Vatican City eventually, and getting to kind of have a little bit of free time. Now, monks, when archaeologists have dug up the remains of some monks that were well preserved by virtue of being in very drafty crypts, basically mummified without really intending to do that. The evidence of parasites in these monks is pretty bad. So monks have it good in the sense of there's somebody else growing most of their food. And for some religious orders within Catholicism, they put some emphasis on growing their own food and being self-sufficient as well as performing their religious duties. But at the same time, they are inventing beer because nobody has any safe drinking water. And every once in a while, like a dead rat falls into the village well and the whole village dies. Because nobody has any idea about things like germs. Nobody has anything to say or understand until Anton van Leeuwenhoek invents the first microscope in Amsterdam or wherever he was from. And up until that point, the corpses of these monks are shot through head to toe with parasites. Parasitic worms, for example. Life was hard. In a lot of the exhumed skeletons or bone records of crypts in France, for example, Paris has hundreds of miles of burial tunnels underneath the city that people still access to this day, get lost down there every once in a while and die. Ironic. When you look at the skull records of people from this time prior to 1500, remember, we don't have modern anesthetics, we don't have modern aseptic surgery techniques, and we don't have stuff like toothpaste. We don't have stuff like dentists. Dentists and barbers and surgeons were literally the same job. Think about that, right? So, we have a whole bunch of people who died with broken jaws because their teeth rotted out. And their teeth rotted out so bad, it went septic and the infection spread and killed them. That's a pretty miserable way to die. Any of you guys ever had like a painful cavity or an abscess? Yeah. Imagine somebody with a blacksmith forged pair of pliers yanking out 2, 3, 4 teeth to try and fix the glitch, and then you die anyway. That's life for a lot of these folks. So we're not really in a societal mode to think about stuff like, let's go backpacking across the Alps. Let's circumnavigate Mont Blanc and go from hostel to hostel where they'll have mulled wine for us and meals and we just pull out our credit card. That's not going to be a thing for a while yet. That's a really cool thing, but it doesn't exist yet for the understandable reason. These people are just trying to stay alive. And we get, as a result of the Black Plague, inventions that we don't really even think about today. They're kind of invisible. Things like surnames. So I'm Logan Park because some of my way back French ancestors were park rangers. It's an aptonym. It's like Dr. Payne, the dentist, right? Pretty cool. So if your last name is Miller or Cooper, right? Those are profession names. If your last name is a geonym, a place name, like Testerville or something like that, that came about because so many people died during multiple waves of the Black Plague and other plagues. That's not the only one on the block. It just happened to kill half of everybody. And the remaining survivors couldn't keep up with the dead bodies. It was pretty horrific. You know, people stacked like cordwood in the streets to eventually get hauled off. So many people died that migrations had to start happening. And so people, for the first time, en masse, across Western Europe, are forced to migrate from their village, which maybe doesn't have enough people to continue being a village, and so it just becomes kind of a ghost town, ghost village. And so to identify oneself, you had to say, I am John the Smith from Willy-Nilly on the Wash, 10 miles up the road, and everybody's dead in Willy-Nilly on the Wash, so I'm ready to be a smith here at, Filthtown, or wherever people were moving to, I don't know. Nasty Brutish being short, right? And so we get stuff like that from these societal upheavals of that time. Now, up until about 1500, we have the Catholic Church as a unifying force politically across Western Europe. Up until this time, the emergence, or the creation of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad, that's a thing that's happening kind of in between this, and Arabic folks invaded southern Europe, Mediterranean, conquered quite a bit of stuff, and made it as far as Spain. That's where we get stuff like chess, and most of our modern mathematics, and stuff like all kinds of innovations and science that then Muslim folks kind of imported as they were conquering along the way. Okay? So, what leisure looks like in this time. Because everybody is just kind of trying to die. From Black Plague, or a tooth infection, or from nasty drinking water, cholera, for example, where you just kind of poop yourself to death, or collapse from septicemia, so body-wide infection. Families are the defining social unit at this time, and extended families become the defining social unit because not only do half or more of the kids pass away before age 5, so you have lots and lots of kids trying to hedge your bets and have enough to help you work the farm, kind of a thing. Or become your apprentice in the smithy or whatever, do some of the manual labor on any of those, stacking wood for the forge, whatever. Everybody's trying to die, so a lot of people are getting raised by aunts, uncles, great aunts second or twice removed, right? So big networks of extended families, and these family records are kept in family Bibles for those who are a little bit more well-to-do by the church, the only people who can read and write, except for limited nobles and so forth. Okay? So leisure is defined by you hanging out with 10 or more, typically, of your cousins, and second cousins, and third cousins, and cousins once, twice, and third removed, and so on and so forth, because people are dropping like flies. Like, one week we go play in the back cow paddock or something like that, and next week we come back and 2 of the kids aren't there anymore. But we get imports among nobles because knights have contact with the Moorish Islamic invaders at the time, and they bring back stuff like that. All these innovations coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, and then we'll later turn around closer to the year 1000 or 1100s and so forth, invade places like Jerusalem and try to take back some of that land for Christendom, right? And so forth. So community and family unit play is how it is for the 99%, and then things like chess, board games, for folks who are a little bit more well-to-do. We also have some archaeological evidence of things like dice games. So the ancient Egyptians, at least as far as we know, had the first example of a 20-sided die. So for those of you who play Dungeons and Dragons, right, that is not a new thing. Imagine carving out of stone a fair 20-sided die. I mean, that's pretty skilled craftsmanship, and you can imagine that it's not like going down to Castle Perilous and getting a D20 for, 30 cents, right? It had to be hand-carved by a pretty skilled artisan to make it anything close to fair. Most folks are not playing with stone dice. That's just too difficult. Not playing with fancy metal dice like we get 3D printed now. They are playing with bone dice. And bone dice have variable density, so they're not particularly fair or evenly weighted. And some folks who are super into playing dice and developing games like craps learn to use that to their advantage. So you get a chicken bone, chop it into a more or less cubic shape, and play some games. There's a whole bunch of, in Northern Europe, runic versions of all this stuff as well. So Christianity didn't really push as far north and west as like Scandinavia, so like Sweden, Norway, places like that. They're still pretty pagan and pretty okay with that. So they have their own versions of a lot of what we're talking about here. Now, we do have, based on the religious sensibilities of that time, another strong bifurcation or division or split or organization along sex lines. So we have men getting into stuff like barroom games and gambling, and you guys are all familiar with cow tipping, right? All right, so cow tipping is allegedly something that folks do to climb into, a cattle pasture and try to tip over a cow that is sleeping and catch it by surprise and so forth. Bull baiting is not against cows, it's versus bulls, and the bull is awake. So this is exactly what it sounds like. This is the leisure version pre-YouTube of "Come at Me, Bro," where the bro is a bull, and you can imagine how that typically ended up. Of course, folks were wildly entertained, apparently, by this. And then in higher society, we have things like these vélés, parties that are specifically for nobles, and they start to take on, because nobles are very much sealed off from how the other 99% are living, they take on these very sort of elaborate, almost like soft rules, like, oh, well, if you're going to our masquerade ball, your mask has to be such and such. It needs to have certain kinds of feathers imported from what later will be the New World, South America, Central America, tropical songbirds and stuff like that. We've seen that tradition continuing until the early 1900s when we started running out of those birds. So we have this strong split, men versus women, right? Women have very sort of carefully prescribed roles and not a ton of mobility outside of those. And the exceptions to that, later on, folks like Queen Elizabeth ends up becoming the exception that kind of demonstrates that rule. So for those of you who are big Jane Austen fans, you're aware of how structured and rigid
women's roles in society up until really through the 1800s and a little bit beyond, how constrictive that was for a lot of people. So we have family play. We have very simple things like going down to the wash at willy-nilly on the wash, the creek or the stream, and getting after it, picking a reed and carving a playable musical instrument out of it. Okay? So, this is not very fun unless you really like playing tag like your whole childhood, right? There's not a whole lot on offer for us at this time because the emphasis is on survival at this time. For folks who are able to survive childhood, for the men, we have this apprentice, journeyman, master dynamic. This is how, because most everybody's illiterate, and most everybody is doing manual work that is nothing automated by factories yet, not for several more centuries. We have this sense of, okay, we're gonna take boys as young as 8, 10 years old, and they're going to wake up at 4 in the morning every day, for Sundays, and start stoking the embers in the furnace so that the smithy can run that day. And the blacksmith, a master smith, is going to have several of those apprentices, and any of them who show promise, they'll get promoted to journeyman, where that person is kind of, we would use the verb apprenticing now, but to keep it clear, they were journeymanning underneath the master cooper, barrel maker, the cobbler, the shoemaker, the smith, who's smithing stuff, and so on and so forth. All of these different leather workers, tanners, and so forth. All of these different skilled professions that were anything other than swinging a hoe to weed a row crop. It took several years of training, and so journeyman, basically through the high school and into sometimes, depending on the profession, into sort of the college age that we have these days, that was their jam, that was their gig. And the master smith or the master cooper or whoever was over them was in a real functional sense, whether or not this was a legal designation, was absolutely master of those journeymen and those apprentices. What that smith says goes, because if the smith doesn't have his furnace up and running and the wood to supply it or the coal later on to supply it for hotter temperatures and stuff like more modern metallurgy, then everybody starves in that particular workshop. So we get stuff like this. Imagine if your professors could hand down rules like this because we say so. Taverns and alehouses he shall not haunt. Dice, cards, or any other unlawful games he shall not use. Fornication with any women he shall not commit. No smoking, no chewing, no drinking, no chasing the girls who do. Right? Matrimony with any woman he shall not contract. Imagine if Ruffner was like, all right, none of you are getting married until you're done with my class, suckers. Right? But this was a thing, right? This was what you agreed to become a journeyman, to even sort of walk through the door on the first day and have a shot at it. He shall not absent himself by day or by night, so no call, no shows, without his master's leave, but be a true and faithful servant. This is taken right out of the contract language of the time. Okay, so we have young men working hard, and that leads to young men playing hard. So we get things like, did you guys ever see West Side Story, that old musical where it's like the Sharks versus the Jets, and it's like singing gang violence? All right, so we have people like walking down the medieval town street snapping, and you got 3-4 wingman bros, and then oh man, this other like it's blacksmiths versus silversmiths, and the silversmiths are like, no, don't break our fingers, we can do fine detail work, And the smiths are like, what? I can't hear you. I'm deaf from the anvil. Anyway, So this was a thing, and these intertrade brawls and the secret societies, we would call them today fraternities, brotherhoods, they were such a big thing that we get that contract language of he shall not absent himself from his master except with his master's leave, right? So in order to protect that, we get at this time the recorded evolution, the creation and evolution, the emergence of secret societies. And this is a thing to this day, right? Like, there are lots and lots of these out there. They're not necessarily tied to professions so much anymore. But if you've ever driven by like a Masonic lodge, started by Masons, stoneworkers, okay? Or an Elks Lodge, something like that. That's a leisure thing. That's also a professional network thing these days. But you also get the exciting secret handshakes and stuff like that. So, all right. We get, so this Benjamin Franklin quote, Benjamin Franklin was not in existence before the year 1500, right? So I'm juxtaposing time a little bit here. But by 1500, we have the invention of beer. And it's spread throughout Western Europe as an alternative, so watered down beer that is basically sterilized by its alcohol content. That's a safer alternative to water. So imagine if you're trying to stay hydrated, for the games, and you're drinking beer all day long to do it. Because if you don't, you get the Hershey squirts, and maybe you die. So we get this kind of tension of, do I want to go this way with my liver exploding, maybe when I'm 60? Do I want to go this way and not deal with being sort of half buzzed all the time?
Yeah.
But also, alcohol's a diuretic, so I need to keep drinking. Yeah.
Was the alcohol content really enough to keep you out of it a little bit, or was it way watered down compared to what it is?
So they didn't have technologies like ice brewing, for example. So they didn't have enhanced or, and they certainly didn't have the chemistry to do stuff like fortified wines or stuff like that yet. So adding alcohol content to stuff as pure alcohol, put an ounce of that in a bottle of wine and it's much stronger. So if you go to the co-op these days and get a sixer of stuff like Dragon's Milk, for example, that'll put you on the floor way faster than stuff like Natty Light, because Natty Light is basically water, and some of these other beers are brewed and then fortified with additional alcohol content, and they are strong. So we get quotes out of this continent-wide milieu of everybody drinking, kids drinking too, because, well, it's safer.
You kind of have to.
Yeah. Drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast. What about 11 seasons second breakfast with his bread and cheese? A pint between breakfast and dinner. A pint at dinner. Dinner is a synonym for lunch in this context at that time. A pint in the afternoon about 6 o'clock, and another when he had done his day's work. Okay? So, dinner and supper, separate things, and all of it sort of blended together in a nice faded blur. We're not really relying on things like scissor or lean these days because those don't exist yet, and that's for recreational purposes, I guess. This is your water. This is your Gatorade, right? Plenty of carbs and electrolytes. Along with this, we have the church, which has invented beer, effectively, trying to figure out how to reconcile, how to keep people alive with things like alcohol against all of the verses in the Bible that say stuff like, do not be drunk on much wine, instead be filled by the Spirit, whatever, it's tension there too. And so there's this sort of
uneasy middle spot of, all right, we need to use this to have safe drinking water, but at the same time, don't go overboard. And of course, we know that alcoholism is a biosocial psychological disease and can pop up kind of anywhere. So we have a lot of alcoholics in this time struggling with that because that was kind of their best option. Another thing that the church is doing along with trying to figure out how to manage and deploy stuff like beer is figuring out how to manage and deploy stuff like assimilated people groups across Europe, and the Eastern Orthodox Church is doing the same thing, but we're not interested in them for this class. So for example, when Christianity starts to take over what the Romans called Germania, right? So Northern Europe, but south of the sea, separating Scandinavia from the rest of Europe. There's a whole bunch of religious festivals or spiritual practices of assimilated peoples. So Germanic tribes, for example, that really sparred pretty hard against the Roman legions. If you ever saw the movie Gladiator, for example, that's exactly what's going on at the beginning of that movie. With people assimilating into Christianity, Christianity also assimilates some things from those cultures so that the look and feel of Christianity as these people who are coming into it unfamiliar, so that they have something recognizable. So it's around this time period that we start to get the modern sensibility of Christmas, right? So, New Testament historians are pretty sure that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, not even close. But it happens to coincide with a pagan, so a Northern European festival called, anybody know? Yule, exactly. And so to this day, we have families doing traditions that are thousands of years old, like burning a Yule log or decorating an evergreen tree. This is all cultural imports to Christianity that came from not where Christianity got started at all, and like 1,000 or more years later. So, this is interesting. One of those festivals that Catholicism kind of wrestled with was Saturnalia. And Saturnalia is like, what do you guys call them these days? A rager, where people are throwing down and pre-partying like for a week to, build up to it. Saturnalia is a big time party in Northern European pagan settings. And Catholicism is like, how can we maybe adjust the whole orgy vibe a little bit?
Yeah.
Put a fresh coat of paint on that, maybe kind of steer folks in a slightly different direction, but still celebrate stuff that week because everybody expects a big celebration that week. What could that look like? We start to see a bunch of essentially Roman Catholic holidays getting set up in this time, lifted directly from assimilated practices. So this counts as leisure, if your jam is definitely smoking, chewing, and drinking and chasing girls to do, then this is your thing back then, okay? So let's focus a little bit on the elites and what things looked like for them, because it's from the elites that we're going to get a more recognizable sense of what you and I, who experienced wealth and ease and convenience that the richest monarchs of Europe never did. Stuff like a hot shower every day, safe food, safe water. We can go to the campus convenience store. Convenience is expensive, but we can get chocolate made halfway around the world 6 months ago that is still good to eat because it's preserved or has preservatives in it, right? Those guys have nothing on us. You and I, as a function of spending fossil fuel energy, have hundreds to thousands of equivalents of human labor called energy slaves. This is a theory pioneered by a guy named Václav Smil. And the sense is, okay, maybe you're the king of England, but, well, like King Henry VIII, he had a jousting lance splinter stuck in his leg for, I don't know, 30 years, and that wound never healed. And his doctors did everything they could, but we just go to the ER and we get shot up with antibiotics and, pay thousands of dollars, whatever the ER is going to charge you, and then you're pretty well good, right? So we have it way better than these guys did. Let's talk through what they did have, because they are going to make choices that show up in the modern conveniences and recreation styles that we recognize today. So when we're talking about the elites, we're talking about upper clergy, not just the local priest who isn't a particularly affluent person at all, but the folks above them, so like bishops and cardinals and so on and so forth. Okay? Scholars. In England, for example, we have places like Oxford, which is a university over 1,000 years old, established near a shallow chunk of a stream called an Oxford. And we have actual kings and queens and nobility, right, the royal lines. And then the landed elite are essentially the knightly class. So when King so-and-so decides to attack King so-and-so over there across the English Channel or in southern France, and we're in northern France or wherever, the call goes out from the king and the king's marshals, essentially their generals, and the call goes out to each of these landed elites. The nobles are given noble rank and title so that when the king needs to call on them to levy troops, both foot soldiers, like serfs with cheap weapons, and knights, the main battle tanks of their time, they have those resources available, okay? And being a knight pays pretty well. The rules of engagement throughout this time developed quite a bit. So, for example, a whole bunch of times across Europe when knights were on the field fighting each other, mowing down peasants with their pikes and stuff like that, and until kind of the invention of the English longbow that really started pushing people's buttholes back in from long distance with high penetration power for the time. When a knight got injured on the battlefield, the battle stopped. I mean, can you imagine that today? Like, somebody's tank breaks down, and everybody's like, wait, game off. We have a breakdown. My horse threw a shoe. Everybody just cool your jets for a sec. We'll get back to you. We have this codification of sort of right and wrong ways to do things. And this is something that only elites are sort of positioned to do, right? The serfs, they're just trying to grow stuff and not get, murdered on the battlefield. So, this is exclusively a thing of the upper classes. And in times of not war, we have, again, that warfare by proxy stuff. So, anybody here ever been fox hunting? All right? What is a typical fox hunt? Like, how do people do that? Or how did you do it? How would you describe a fox hunt?
Me?
Yeah.
I went with my uncle when I was small, and we kind of like trapping and like hunting too.
Okay.
So it's kind of different. We made like little foot traps,
Okay.
stuff like that, and came back the next day and killed it.
All right. So, trapping, for example, is something that anybody can do, but on an island,
for a continuously settled civilization like mainland Europe, we have a lot of mouths to feed, at least not when we're half dying from Black Plague. We have a lot of mouths to feed, and not a lot of like mesocarnivores or apex predators like wolves and foxes and so on and so forth to go around. Maybe not a lot of deer either. So we get fox hunts that are legally only possible if you are landed wealthy or higher on the ladder. Okay? We have things like, you guys are familiar with the place Sherwood Forest? Where do we get Sherwood Forest from? What stories? The stories of Robin Hood, exactly. Okay? Sherwood Forest was a hunting reserve for the king. And in most versions of that story, the king, King Richard, Richard the Lionheart, was off fighting the Crusades. So this is in like the 11, 12, 1300s range time-wise. And his evil sort of, what would we call Prince John these days? Kind of a beta cuck, maybe. I don't know. Not somebody that people like aspire to be, you know? I apologize if that term is offensive. I don't know. My day job prevents me from keeping it real. Correct me if I'm wrong. So Prince John is running the show back home while King Richard is busy unaliving brown people out in the Eastern Mediterranean around Jerusalem. And Robin Hood is a crusader. He is wounded and comes back to England early and arrives to find that his family's property is Robin of Locksley, so his estate is Locksley, and he would be Sir Robin and so forth. That has been taken over by Prince John. And so Robin is forced to live on the run because he is a persona non grata. He is an inconvenient survivor of the Crusades and poses a threat to Prince John if he can get his land back. So he starts to live in Sherwood Forest, a royal hunting reserve. This would be like if the Shawnee National Forest could be hunted, or Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge could be hunted by one family, period. And the penalty for anybody else was getting your hands cut off or your head cut off if you tried to get after that. So, Robin Hood sets up shop there, middle finger to the law, as rappers say, and starts stealing from the rich, Prince John's taxation caravans, basically, and giving to the poor. And we get this sense of right and wrong and what will come to be called noblesse oblige. The responsibility of the wealthy. Robin of Locksley, the fictional character, embodied this ideal of, I have some resources, and there's a bunch of starving people. Let me see what I can do for them in addition to, you know, fighting my war against Prince John. And eventually, in most versions of the story, King Richard comes back and is like, Robin, bro, what's going on, man? Why are you fighting my brother? Why is my brother fighting you? And Robin says, man, your little brother he's just got this, listen here, you little shit energy. And King Richard's like, yeah, don't forget that. And, you know, kicks Prince John off of the effective throne, restores Robin of Locksley's estate's titles, uplifts the merry band of men, including Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, etc. All those guys. And in some versions of the story, some women. And out of this, we get the idea of chivalry, or the modern sense of chivalry, which is from the root for horsemanship, chevalier. Okay. So in the 1100s, we get this sense of, okay, if you have a title, if you are nobility, you are called to live in a more noble way. And we're going to codify some of those rules of living in a higher way as chivalry. So this is kind of Eleanor of Aquitaine's move to get some rough and ready war-fighting guys to do things like compete in knightly tournaments and compete for the favor of the local noble lady. So, phallic metaphors about lances aside, this is a pretty important thing, and we see in modern sports and in stuff like backpacking sort of low-key rules, or explicit rules in the case of sports, that date back to the establishment of chivalry. So, like if you knock your opponent off their horse in a knightly tournament, you wait for them to get back up, you let their squire go to them and help that person back up, because if you don't, they don't have to let you back up if they unhorse you, okay? So, ritualizing things, adding this sense of fame and celebrity and romance to it. So we have women starting to tie their handkerchiefs at the end of a lance of somebody that they favor and so forth, to say, basically in a medieval way, you know, slide into my DMs or whatever you guys say these days on Tinder. Oh. So, Western Europe, a thing. All right, let's end it right there. I've run over a little bit. We'll pick it up with John Calvin. We're going to swing it hard from conquering people and nightly tournaments over to like Bible study. All right, see you guys on Tuesday.